Oh, there we go. Hello. We are live. Welcome to Hell in a Handbasket. This is open mic session number 8. And today we're going to talk a little bit about Africa because, frankly, I'm sick of hearing about Iran. I'm sick of hearing about Ukraine. So the thought was we would branch out a little bit. Last week I really liked our discussion because we were focused on Spain and the migration issue with Spain, which was a nice, welcome change of pace. So we were chatting throughout the week, and one thing I always wanted to do with Bradley, I wanted to do a deep dive into Africa because it's a continent that certainly doesn't get the exposure that it deserves. And I know that hopefully Coping joins. He's pretty well versed in Africa, so if he joins, I'd love to get his opinion and pick his brain on the various going on with Africa. But in a nutshell, I think that first and foremost, let me throw up a map of Africa because it is absolutely enormous. So, as you can see here, there's a lot going on in Africa. 54 countries. Africa is there's Wayne. Hey, Wayne.
Not too bad. Just give me a sec. I got to turn the volume up here.
Oh, take your time. I was just giving a little bit of an overview on Africa and what.
There we are. That's better.
Yeah, I just wanted to give an overview of Africa and what I hope to achieve today, because I don't know if you're like me, but I'm sick to death of hearing about Iran and what's going to happen and is there a deal? There's no deal. Blah, blah. It's like Groundhog Day every day. And same with Ukraine. So I really enjoyed our discussion last week where we focused exclusively on Spain and the migrant crisis. So one thing that I've always had in my back burner to jump into, I'd really like to do a deep dive into Africa because it's a continent that just doesn't get the coverage that it really deserves. And just a bit of a background and whatnot to the crisis, to Africa, I should say. It's the second largest continent in the world. As you can see there in the picture, there's 54 different countries. And I kind of get the feeling that certainly the Western view of Africa has always been, Africa is this backward place and the people there are all tribal and it's all very uneducated and they can't get their shit together long enough to build what we have in the West. And I think that that's an unfair commentary of a continent of 54 different countries, right? It's very difficult to lump them all into, these people are just idiots and they can't govern themselves. But that's pretty much the opinion of Africa and much of the West. And I think that we take for granted quite often the rich history that Africa really has. You go back to the Kingdom of Kush back during the Greek times, and it was a real power and a counterweight against the Greeks. And this was a kingdom that was a rival to the Egyptian Empire in terms of its trade influence. And then you look, throughout the ages, you've got, the great Songhai Empire that controlled all the trans-Saharan trade routes. And then you have the great Mali Empire with its rich wealth as well. Timbuktu, back in the day, was a center for learning. And people used to come from all over, not just all over Africa, other parts of the world, they would go to Timbuktu to learn, you know,
Oh yeah,
and
the archives that they had there were absolutely fantastic.
yeah,
Luckily, when the fighting started, they managed to get most of it out, is what I'm told.
yeah. So,
One of the big
we've had,
problems, though, studying Africa, and this has been pointed out by several historians, is that most of the history of Africa isn't written in English. It's like
right,
trying
right.
to study the history of Russia. Most of the history of Russia isn't written in English, so you miss a lot of stuff.
Sure. Yeah, I can buy that. And you've got so many different languages and, language changes over time. Yeah, I can believe that. Um, but I think that, if we fast forward, if we were to go back 2000 years ago or 3000 years ago, the the view of, you know, I'll call it Africa, even though it was something very different then, the view of Africa was much different. Like I said, you think about the Kingdom of Kush, and then you also think during, you fast forward to the Roman times, and we had the Great Punic Wars, so the Romans against Carthage, and like these were real powers in the region that we kind of take for granted now. And I
Yeah.
think largely that's due to colonialization that happened
Um,
in the
mm,
1800s.
I'm going to argue something different. What
Sure.
happened was the independent powers around the Mediterranean all got taken over by Rome,
Mhm.
and from that point forward, you stop hearing about the history from further down in the continent.
Yeah, I can believe that. Yeah, that's
And the
fair.
other thing is, sorry, this is me. I've been studying a bunch of stuff in anthropology, and one of the things that has interested me is when the Sahara blocks or doesn't block migration. And during the Roman period, the Sahara didn't block migration, the early Roman period, but by the mid to late Roman period, it did. The
Okay,
desert.
why?
Why? Because the desert was going through a drying cycle at that point. North Africa used to be incredibly fertile.
Oh yeah. Well, that's why it was fought over so much. Like that's effectively why the battle with Carthage took place against the Romans, because what people don't realize, to your point, this region up here, especially like Western Algeria, Tunisia, Eastern Algeria and Western Libya, this area here, this is very fertile land. And that was effectively the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. Like
Yep,
they
that
didn't,
in Egypt, a country which can't feed itself now, but
right, right.
in those times, it was. I mean, we have actual historical records of famines hitting Judea and Palestine,
Mhm.
Israel area, in other words. And when I'm using the name, what I'm using the names that they used back then for the areas. So that's why I said Judah. Um, and what they would do is when famines got really bad, some families would refugee out to Egypt, which took some of the stress off the locals and allowed more of them to survive. And a few
Yeah,
years later, when they heard the famine was gone, they'd come back.
yeah, I can buy that. I mean, but this area up here, that's effectively what was being fought over during those Punic Wars, and that
Mhm.
was well over 2,000 years ago now. So, because it was effectively, and it became after the Romans won those Punic Wars, it was the breadbasket of Rome that fed Rome for the next 400 years. So very fertile land, very important land for a number of reasons. It had access to the ocean, access to the seas. Like I said, very fertile land, lots of mineral wealth that, obviously we look at. So yeah, I agree with you. As the Romans conquered all of the Mediterranean, yeah, to the victors go the spoils, and you probably heard much less about anything that was south of their realm because it just wasn't relevant. And then, but what I mean by the colonial era, I think about, as Europe became more and more powerful and hence industrialized, the need for resources grew, right? Because, Europe itself is not really rich in natural resources, not compared to other big players such as, your Russia, Canada, US, Australia. Uh, Europe is kind of like a flat plain of resourceless area. Like all the easy to mine resources, for example, that was all mined 1,000 years ago. So it got to the point in Europe where they ran out of silver, if you recall, probably about 600 years ago, and they just didn't. They had no silver left. They couldn't mint coins. They couldn't do shit. So that's when you started seeing these empires, whether it be Spain, Portugal, later England, France, Germany. That's when they all start, the Dutch, that's when they all start going and exploring other parts of the world, whether it be the New World, Africa, and so on, because really they were looking for resources more than anything else to bring back to their home countries because they just didn't have those resources, in large quantity where they were. So throughout the various empires, whether it be the Dutch in Africa or Portugal, like I said, the Spanish, certainly the French, and later the English, you basically had, I'll say, several hundred years of colonialization, not just in Africa, but other parts of the world, as we know, North America, South America, and so on. And that all came to a head in, I would argue, the late 19th century with the Berlin Conference. So in 1885, all the various European players on the continent of Africa, Germany, Portugal, Spain, France, England, they all met in Berlin. And effectively, the map, or an iteration of this map, was drawn up then. So without any input from the people there, but basically the colonial powers of the day decided to literally carve up the map, create these borders that you see. And okay, Portugal, this is yours. Spain, this is yours. France, this is yours. So that was in 1885. And effectively, since then, the African continent has been a colonial project for these Western nations up until the 1960s, let's say. We started getting the various independence movements, whether it be, I think the first one was in Ghana in 57. And then we saw independence movements throughout these colonial entities throughout the 60s and 70s. So, what I think the colonial powers realized in the 50s and 60s, well, a couple things. Number one, they were flat ass broke after World War II. So they didn't necessarily have, the money to maintain all of these colonial projects elsewhere when, they needed that funding and that capital at home. So to maintain an empire costs a lot of dough. So I think a lot of these countries back in the 50s and 60s, they were probably all too happy to get rid of their they were probably all too happy to get rid of their, ownership, shall we say, of these colonial nations. But they didn't
Actually,
want to get.
here's a point that you may not know.
Sure.
I was listening to one historian. He was talking about how England had actually tried to divest itself of its colonies back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, by
Uh-huh.
means of basically inventing the Commonwealth then and making
Yeah.
it
Well,
basically a European Union alternative.
right.
There
But
was
that's
a
what I'm
plan at
getting
one
to.
point to try that, and it never happened, unfortunately. Oh, by the way,
Well,
in
that's
case you're wondering why I'm looking down, I'm sharing the link to the stream on all the social media platforms I'm on.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and that's what I'm getting to as well is with the independence movements of the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. I think that the West was all too happy to give up their direct participation in, maintaining those colonial projects. They were all too happy to, forego the bill for it, but they didn't want to rest their control over these entities. So what you saw was them back out and give these nations independence on paper, but in practice, through control over funding mechanisms such as the IMF and the World Bank, they didn't really lose control over them, because, they still had the banker's bill, the
I
banker's
would
ability to fund, right?
tend to argue that that wasn't necessarily true about all of them. How should I put it? The French were extremely sticky with their colonies.
Sure.
The British, on the other hand, weren't. The Portuguese, well, they were also extremely sticky on their colonies. They did not want to let go of them, and they held on to them basically longer than the French did officially. The French have held on longer
Yep.
unofficially. It's
Yep.
The record of colonialism is one of blood and tears mostly.
Yeah, you'll get no argument from me there. And I agree with you. I think, the French held on, but then the Portuguese, they were more like in the 1970s in places like Angola and Mozambique.
Oh yeah.
But I think my point though
Don't forget, I
is,
was alive then.
oh yeah, so was I. But well, I was a baby. But I think you've got. I think my comment about changing how they maintain power through the use of these international financing organizations as well as the puppetry that is the UN. I think that's still valid. And we see that up to and including today. So you've got, countries that need, loans of some kind, development loans and funding, but it's all been going through greedy, corrupt organizations such as the IMF and the World Bank, which tie strings to all of their funding, right?
Yeah.
So
Well,
you guys have
actually, hold on a second. You go to a bank, you take out a loan, they put strings on you.
Sure.
When there's money owed, this is normal. I can understand that the countries don't like it, but you're loaning money. You have a certain right to say, "Hey, I want to make sure this is used properly." What are you doing?
Sure, but there's a difference though. I can go to the bank and I can get a loan. And as long as I'm not a credit risk to them and they do their assessment based on my credit rating and stuff and my income and all that stuff, they'll give me the loan straight up. They don't care what I'm using it
Okay,
for. Like
you go to get a loan to buy a Lamborghini,
yep,
and you get the money and you head to Vegas and gamble it all away.
yep, I still owe the money, right? And that's all the bank cares. As long as they get their interest and principal back, they're good. The difference with the IMF and the World Bank, though, is the strings are social. The strings are, you guys need to implement trans rights. You guys need to grow wheat as opposed to your natively eaten crops because we need wheat. You guys need to privatize your industries. These were the strings that were given to these African nations in exchange for funding. And, if you look at the history of what the West does, that's what we do. We go in, we offer loans with strings attached, and then we go in and we privatize anything that's not nailed down. We gouge them of whatever resources we can through bribes of their corrupt politicians. And that's effectively been the experience of Africa since I've been alive, man. Like it's just been one successive corrupt government after another. And I'm not blaming the West for that. You got to blame the people there too. And why do you guys continually put up with this stuff? But that's basically been the experience of a lot of African nations the last 50 years is, um, you know, any development money that they've received, it hasn't been well spent. I'll give you an example. I was in Kenya maybe about 20 years ago, and we're driving outside of Nairobi, and the driver, he was our guide, and great guy. And we were driving along, and we were on this road, and the road was shitholed, completely shitholed. And like, and I saw the signs there because they had a sign there. I think it was World Bank, if I'm not mistaken. And it was, this project, funded by the World Gang, one of those type of signs that you see where the government wants to toot their own horn or whatever. And I said to the guy, his name was David. I said to David, I said, so I bet you guys will be happy once this gets updated and repaired, eh? And he looked at me, he said, what are you talking about? It already has been. And I said to him, what do you mean? And he said, yeah, they finished the project. This is the project. And he said they finished it like a year ago. They just haven't taken down the signs. But literally, Wayne, if you had been on that street or that road, it was a highway that I was on, you never in your wildest dreams would have thought that it was a brand new highway because it was literally shithole. And what he explained to me, he said, yeah, that's how it is here. These guys from the IMF, World Bank, or whatever, they make these announcements. If there is funding, the funding certainly doesn't get down to the project level because by the time it gets down to actually shovels in the ground, everybody else has taken their cut. They've all been bribed, paid off, whatever, that there's really no money or very little money to actually do the project. So therefore, what ends up happening is they pay somebody to do a shit job who don't know what they're doing, and the end result is garbage. So he basically said, if we do get something, it's garbage. But he said more often than not, we don't even get the garbage because all of the grift that's going on up above. He said that's just the way it is, and he said it's been that way for decades. So I was just shocked that that was a brand new highway, personally.
Hang on just
Yeah,
a sec. I got. I'm still here. I have to step on the screen for a moment because I need to switch my hearing.
yeah, sure. So, as Wayne and I were just talking about, I think that we saw that wave of independence movements largely in the late 50s, 1960s, early 70s. And Africa ever since then has been trying to grow up and become a world player. But the problem is, number one, admittedly, there's been a ton of corruption there. It's really not hard to pay off people when you're starving, But, and what I'd really like to talk about is the shift that we've seen away from that model, mostly in the last 20 years or so, I would say. You're starting to see a lot of shifts outside of the traditional Western model. So for decades, the African countries politically, or particularly the ones that were colonialized, they would always go back to their colonial masters for money. But given the last 20 years or so, we've seen, number one, the tremendous growth and rise of China. And China has, for the last 20 years or so, they've really got a different investment model through the Belt and Road Initiative than is offered through the Western model. So in the last 20 years, we've seen a ton of infrastructure investment without this sort of Western involvement and hence Western conditionality, I'll say. Um, we've seen a lot more trade in raw materials because China, as you know, is a manufacturing powerhouse. They're like trying to gobble up inputs wherever they can get it all over the world. And I think that that approach, China's approach, is very much more hands off. Like to our analogy about going to the bank, China's like, yeah, you want, we want to help you build an airport. Here's the loan for the airport. We're going to come help you build it. And we expect X interest rate back on our return. Government agrees. The only difference is China's actually going in and they're building those projects as opposed to doing shit jobs. Is it in their benefit to do so? Of course so. We can talk all day about why the Chinese are developing this Belt and Road Initiative. Um, but it's absolutely to their advantage too, because they want to have good logistics all over the world because it helps them with their manufacturing base and their shipping. So, but the difference is they're not beholden to the West the same way they are with China. China is very much more transactional, I think. And we're
Yeah,
starting to
the big
see
problem is
there's a
the
lot more.
Chinese. Sorry. The big problem is the Chinese are going bankrupt
I don't know how you can say that, Wayne, when they're growing that much and they've got
because I
oodles of
listened
money.
to economists who actually have a freaking clue. They
Okay.
have spent a lot of money and they have overbuilt in a variety of industries, and all the money spent on this overbuilt is basically thrown away. They have enough high-speed rail to, well, cover all of Africa, just in the area of China itself. And a lot of the high-speed rail is not earning the money back that is needed to justify the expense of building it. They have cities with two airports where one airport would, quite frankly, do fine. They've got all these places where they built cities out in the desert, figuring people would move in. And all of a sudden, you've got all these empty cities sitting there. Look at that. Oh, damn it. What's the name of that place? Pyongyang. Uh, Xi Jinping's great project to make a second capital for China next to Beijing. You know, it's supposed to be the best city
Okay.
in the world, and nobody wants to live there. They build it all up, but no one's there. They try to get the universities to move. They try to get businesses to move, and they all said, "Nope, we're staying where we are."
Well, even if everything that you said was true, right? And they've got a bunch of empty cities and they've got overcapacity on their high speed rail, so on and so forth. That would all still be internal to China. How China invests outside of China through their Belt and Road Initiative, I don't see how that's going to impact anybody besides those projects themselves. Now, you can make the argument that China may one day go bankrupt and they're not going to have the money to fund such projects. Sure, I don't know if that's true. But what I'm saying is the existing projects that are in the can, whether they be in Africa or anywhere else, like look at the Chankay port in Peru, doing phenomenally, right? So my point is that China's model was we will give you the money to invest. It'll be win-win cooperation because you get an asset, a usable asset at the end of it. We're going to get return on our investment. We're also going to get employment for our workers, who are going to largely be the engineers and the builders on these projects. So we're happy, you're happy, and at the end of the day, you have an asset that you can use. Right. Look at the airport. They Chinese have built tons of airports in Africa and railroads and stuff like that that just didn't exist anymore. So all of that built out infrastructure can only benefit them economically in the long term, right? Uh,
Ever hear of Tafu Drag?
Here, what?
Tafu Drag?
No, it's that.
It's a term Chinese have for their construction practices.
Right.
The dregs from tofu are basically a absolute mess of. And when you're making tofu, you end up with this stuff left over that's really hard to describe. It's basically plant material, and it's not something you use for building construction. In other words, a Chinese official who inspected a site that collapsed said, "This looks like tofu dregs." And the term is caught on. It's what they use whenever something in China falls down. They call it tofu dreg. It's what they called it when that building in Thailand collapsed just after China completed it. It's what they called it when that train station in, God damn it, what country was it? Not Serbia, Hungary. Train station in Hungary collapsed just after it was opened. It was built by China. Tofu dreg. When you deal with China, you have to be very careful. And you keep saying China doesn't put any limits on what you do with it. Well, how do you know that? Have you read the contracts? China might
Well,
be
how
able
do
to
you how do you
change here,
how do you
but
know they do? How do you know they do? Like I could easily ask that too. I'm just reading all the evidence that I've ever read was China. No, they don't put any sort of I'll call it social engineering uh, clauses into their contracts. They don't do anything like
oh
that. It's
yes,
all
they
very
do.
financial.
Yes,
Okay, have
they
you read
do.
the contracts? Tell me one.
Okay, one of the things that they do is they set it up so that no Chinese citizen who commits a crime can be prosecuted in that country.
I doubt that's true.
That's one of the things that they try and do. There's
But
some
have they done it
reporting
though?
from,
You
yeah,
could you could say
there
the
is
same thing.
solid reporting that they have done it.
Reporting by who? You could say the same thing about Americans. Americans military have that same protection in lots of places. So
Oh, I know, but I'm just saying you were saying um, there's no limits on what the country that is the money is donated to can do, and or loaned to, and I'm saying that yes, there are limitations on it. China will have a contract with these people. Just because you haven't seen it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, and they will have put limitations on it. And these limitations will be such as favor China, of course. I mean, it's like any bank. You always put on limitations that favor you. And the question is whether or not the customer is willing to put up with those limitations.
yeah, but I've never seen evidence that that exists outside your standard terms. Like I don't think China is, for example,
Oh God,
going
follow some
into
African media, damn it.
okay, so I've
You've
never
got
seen
stuff
an example.
being reported on this in let's see, it was Kenya. There was problems. Shit. I think it was Kenya and Tanzania where they had a couple projects that went totally fucking sideways. And
Mhm.
then there's what's his name? Burkina Faso, Traore, that dipshit
Traore.
there. Yeah. He's apparently been, how should I put it? Had his fingers in the till. You know how that line in the song goes, and as for politicians, can any more be said? Their fingers all are in the till, their skulls are made of lead.
Right, but where are you getting this from? Like I've never heard that
African
Traore
media,
was
for
on the
God's
take.
sakes. Check African
Yes,
media. I sent
I
you.
read a lot of African media.
Okay, well, you obviously are reading in some really odd places because I'm seeing reports of this. I'm seeing reports of African locals being so pissed off that they're rioting and burning Chinese stores.
But hold on, well, let me because let's not forget Africa is actually. By the way, hi. Well, I'm sorry for being late. I streamed out seven through a looper, but we all know that Africa is not a country, right? So we can be a little bit more specific on it. So you mentioned Kenya and Tanzania. That's also where China has the most of its, any aid program and such like that. Which so that makes sense. But I do also think that it should be noted that any form of endemic corruption or so forth, like whatever is tied up to IMF and the West is going to be having the same replicated dynamic with China. And I mean, China is also one of the lenders through the IMF as well, borrower and lender in the IMF. So it's kind of like a, but as for the social thing, because what Nunya is mentioning, that one is true, but it kind of misses an important detail. One of the reasons that the Chinese do not make these comprehensive economic reforms and also on the social level is because the West have already done it. Right? They don't need to be having more of the extra privatizations or whatever so forth. Like it's already laid out bare and readily available for China. And as for the sometimes, on paper it can seem more beneficial, like lower interest and returns and yields to make the same loans which the West would not give or the IMF would not give. But that's not really a high bar, because the IMF and the West have like quite exploitative rates anyways when they have set up these loans. So it's still, and so what happens is very often that many of these countries, whether it be the East or the West, they would still find themselves in some perpetual debt cycle. The Chinese are no different in that regard. I mean, I strongly suspect that's what they're going to do with the Russians if the Russians find themselves compelled to such an. But not to digress, though, um, but they do approach it differently in the sense that the West does not try. The West tries to more often get in on the social dynamics on a more minute detail. So here I'll give a specific example with Ghana, and here it will not be favorable neither to the West nor to China. So when it comes to the West, for example, a couple of 2-3 years ago, I believe it was, and I was there, so I got to hear the opinion of what people had to say on it. So we can get on that. But what it wasn't only the IMF, but it was through definitely Western aid programs. Demanding that, and it was under the Biden administration. So this was before Doge and before all that kind of stuff, right? So it was that they were to decriminalize homosexuality, because currently it was illegal, and the response of the Ghanaian government was to just double down on like they just put harsher punishments on it. Now, from the vantage of people in Ghana, it was, yeah, who the fuck are these foreigners to say something? But also, like, do you have to try to antagonize them because we actually do need them? Like, even it's like it's a subservient role, but it's like, okay, if you do not have them, what is the alternative? Well, enter China. One thing that Ghana has a particular, like, this is reaching crisis levels, is that their freshwater supply is polluted by illegal gold mining. And this is a very clearly connected with the Chinese activity. Like you have Chinese miners or backmen who are facilitating for this illicit artisanal mining, and they take no consideration of where they dump their mercury products, like straight into drinking water, lakes, and whatnot. So several water treatment facilities in Ghana had to shut down because they were simply not made to treat that kind of pollution. So the downstream effect is pretty severe for people in Ghana as well. So like, yeah, they're definitely caught in between a rock and a hard place. But I say, to kind of to the point, China may be a little bit less so than the West was, but the example I gave, which is congruent with what Nunya said, which is to kind of, because the condition was you decriminalize homosexuality and this and that thing, or you will not get this loan, or we will cut this aid, or whatever, right? So this is kind of the dynamic of aid, which we all know. But with Doge and everything, I am actually not like, I haven't seen anything from the United States, at least, and the Europeans, generally speaking, seem to be. I haven't noticed much, but that's might just be because I haven't picked it up. But I thought I'd just throw that in there. Like, Ghana will
Well,
be
all the
different from.
NGOs are broke now. But yes, and to your point, yes, I agree with you. Do I think, and I said this to Wayne 5 minutes ago, the Chinese are looking out for their own interests, absolutely. And if they're, polluting a river because they can, uh, yeah, that sucks. But I'd also throw out the argument that they had polluted rivers 30 years ago too under the West. So is China still getting exploited? Or not China? Are the African nations still getting exploited? Yeah, for sure. But the difference I see, at least with China, with all the development work that they're doing there, they are number one, they're improving their infrastructure. And number two, by all research and all reading I've ever seen, they're getting much better deals for the resources from the Chinas of the world, the Turkeys of the world, the Indias of the world, than they ever did from the Americas of the world, or certainly the Frances of the world, right? And we can go back to the Niger uranium example, how they've been getting ripped off from France for decades now on uranium. That's just one example. They're now getting better deals for that stuff as they kind of mature. Now, are they there? No, it'll take decades more, but at least through the building of infrastructure that benefits the people, I think that that's a step in the positive direction. I'll give you an example. Back, under IMF control, you would read about, oh yeah, the IMF country XYZ is getting IMF money to fund a railroad. And everybody thinks, oh, well, that's good. A railroad's good. What they never told you was that railroad only went to one place, which was the mine. And it would load up on ore, and then it would, transit it to the sea. So it wasn't necessarily a passenger railroad. But we'd never hear about that stuff in the West. All we'd hear would be the headline that, we're building railroads. At least now with some of these, particularly transit projects like airports and like roads, we're starting to see, these countries, at the very least, they're starting to get benefit from these loans, as opposed to the top 1% getting all the money and everybody else still living in poverty. I know I'm naive, but that's the hope.
I don't think you're entirely wrong. I do think because it's a somewhat different mechanic behind it. I think I might have misheard, but I think Wayne maybe touched upon it, which is the case. Because China's approach to it is they integrate much more of their own domestic industry and workers, and also their own currency actually in much of while the projects are going, and then afterwards. But the what I kind of also noticed about that is you can, just like with a mine, let's put it like that, or a farmland or whatever, you can also own and get the subsequent revenue from any infrastructure projects, which are something the West have done, but they have done it in a somewhat more limited capacity. I do agree with you that in some ways, like where I think the advantages for African countries, or some African countries, is that the interests for China that go cross border in particular, and thus they put in those infrastructure projects, it does make them more dependent on China. It does make them more susceptible to economic coercion from that direction. And it is most likely because what I've also noticed is that just like you said, like, are you actually eligible for maintaining these loans? Well, China doesn't give a shit either. They also just issue out, and then instead they just lease and own the infrastructure projects themselves. So they still do pretty much the same. It just looks a bit different on the surface. But the advantage, though, for many African countries, I think, is twofold. One, they have an alternative, and two, there are some cross-border infrastructure that are that does in the long run provide them some sort of leverage. But of course, this really depends on how they're operating. I would say the bottom line is, for China, the way they're operating is that they're building their kind of their own cliques of elite. I'm not so sure that the benefiting the people is necessarily the thing that's going to matter as much. I think it's going to be benefiting some people, and like if they uplift a segment of the population, that's like, if it's an improvement, it's an improvement anyways, right? So it's in, but I do think it's going to be more in that direction. I do not think that I don't see China's involvement being in and of by itself something that translates to a general benefit for for these countries. And again, it depends a
Oh,
bit. I think it's
and
harder for those in the
I
east.
wasn't saying that.
Mm.
And just to be clear, I wasn't saying that China is. I said this before to Wayne. I don't think they're altruistic whatsoever. You know, they have their own agenda, like every nation does, and their agenda in Africa is first and foremost securing whatever deals they can, primarily for resources, and number two, building out the logistics that make securing those resources uh, easy, right? So, absolutely, that's China's game. But that's no different than the Western game that the Africans have been playing the last 60 years. The only difference, I guess, in my view, is at least they're starting you're starting to see assets on the continent being generated, which before you never did. So that can only be a good thing. I'll give you a perfect example. Now, and the onus isn't on China to better the lives of African people. That the onus is on the various governments of those African nations to do that. And we'll use Tri-Area as an example since Wayne brought them up. They just built a road in Mali that the previous government was looking to secure an IMF loan to build this road, right? And they were told, well, this road is going to cost, I think they said it was going to cost $10 billion and it's going to take 10 years. And we're going to have to bring in all of these, foreign engineers and all these foreign workers. It's going to take 10 years to build. And here's the price tag. Thank you very much. Please sign. Traore said, nope, that's way too crazy a price. What Mali did instead, or Burkina Faso, I should say, not Mali. What Burkina Faso did instead, they went out, they bought a bunch of heavy machinery, tractors and diggers and all that stuff that you need in construction. And he basically said, we're going to build this road ourselves. And you know what? They did. And they built it in less than a year with their own people, their own engineers, their own surveyors, and their own equipment. And now they have that equipment for the next project. And that's what he was saying then. He said, we're going to make this investment in our equipment so we can build this ourselves, establish companies and whatever it may be, but we're going to build it all internally. And the thing about it is, they actually succeeded. So the people in Burkina Faso, they're starting to see actual progress. And you're starting to see progress in Mali. You're starting, like all these countries that are starting to do this, they're starting to see some benefits to it. Whereas 30 years ago, getting a loan from the IMF, using my Kenya example of when I was there in the Kenyan road, you're pissing up a rope, right? Because it was all gone before the project even started.
Oh, I agree. Bringing in the equipment and doing the work yourself is a lot better if the job gets done right.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I have a bit of a problem because I don't think, okay, I've never met the man, obviously. I've seen Traore a couple times on videos, and quite frankly, he rather reminds me of Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin.
How? The dude's like 36 years old.
But hold on, how is that
A
about you? Because
self-centered
that's
fucker
precisely what
who thinks he's God's gift to everything.
I don't get that read of Traore, to be honest. I would say like Traore, I think Burkina Faso is a very good example, but it should also be noted as somewhat of an exception. I think because the Nunya outlined the things, as far as I have understood it, is factually correct. And that is a step in the right direction. And they're also taking a few others, which, like where you see Burkina Faso is they're using the Russians, for example, as well, in order to kind of leverage their position alongside with the Chinese. And there are a few mishaps going on here. I don't think you should necessarily compare Burkina Faso to Mali, because I get the impression Mali is in a much tougher spot than Burkina Faso. Like they're not necessarily in a more tough spot, but they have not taken the same steps that kind of make them a little bit more, give them more wriggle room, like the Burkinabes. The Malayans, I think, have because you've seen them have to take much more measures that shut down their country and just ravaged their own economy. They haven't really bought. I haven't heard them buying in tractors and building roads and doing those initiatives like Burkina Faso. And I
Yeah,
recall,
Mali's got an ongoing insurgency in the north, and it actually controls something like half the country now.
yeah,
And it's
over
really
half the
hard to build
country.
stuff when you've got that sort of thing going on.
Yeah, like they went. It went so far that they had to shut down their borders in order to try. And basically, they quelled themselves and their own economy in an attempt to quell the the Durkas or the other separatists in Mali, because it's basically, and it's a kind of an unlikely alliance. But anyways, like my point was that when it comes to Burkina Faso and I mean, they still have quite a lot of restrictions on their media, so I think like some things should be taken with a grain of salt. But one thing that I recall from, well, the DPA open mic, we had those recordings, right, and we touched a bit on Africa, and we had Macchiari from Kenya, and we had three others from the Sahel region, from Guinea and Mali, and then now I forgot, but anyways. Oh yeah, no, we had Vosh from Angola, right? So it was not from that, but anyways. So Burkina Faso is actually a very, I see that frequently when I look into miscellaneous, be them political and or generally non-political but occasionally political YouTubers. Burkina Faso, like it's very easy to see, like they inspire a lot, and I do think they rightly so do so. Like they do kind of show like you kind of actually have to take your own steps, right? You can't just blame the West or the others or rely on the West or the others, right? You have to, like um in that one, that's
And
what they I remember Macchiari, he said one of the reasons he believes that Burkina Faso is in that kind of cultural position is because they took forms of Marxism as a way to organize, but they didn't necessarily take Marxism to heart in the European manner. They took more like they took some elements of it and adapted it to themselves, which is really what you should do, right? You should adapt it to where you are in the situation. And so I'm not rambling, but Burkina Faso is a very interesting, but it is also an exception to some extent, in my opinion. I don't think it should be considered a norm exactly.
No, I agree. But you're starting to see these norms become more normal. And by that, I mean, I think if you were to, it's not like anti Western sentiment in Africa hasn't existed for years, right? It always has, because they didn't want to be colonized. And there were wars fought over them being colonized, right? Various, tribal groups in the 19th century, 20th century, so on and so forth. They weren't successful. The difference now, though, is they've got other options that they didn't have during the days of Thomas Sankara or even Gaddafi, for that matter. Like, there have been pro-African, I'll call them pro-African nationalists, even though that's not what they are, but you know what I mean. There have been these people like the Gaddafis and like Thomas Sankara and like the guy in the DRC whose name I keep forgetting. Shoot. But what was his name that they killed? The Belgians killed.
Lumumba or something like that, I think.
Yes, sir. Yeah, Lumumba.
Yeah.
So these leaders have always existed in Africa, and they always got overwhelming support in Africa, even outside of their own countries. The only problem was they didn't have the number one, the organization, because look at the map there, for Christ's sake, it's 54 different countries. How do you create an organized front with that, alphabet soup of countries, right? And that's by design.
Look at it.
Like the
It's the most complicated continent on the bloody planet geopolitically.
Right. But that was by design, though, right? When that Berlin conference.
Okay, there's two factors here. First, a lot of the colonizers drew up borders that made no fucking sense from a tribal point of view. And that's something that's very well known, and that, quite frankly, it's something the Russians did too with the stands. They carved them up in such a way that they divided the tribes, and it's still causing problems to this day. But
That was the point.
fact that there are countries that are almost 100% one tribe. There are a few of them, and Africa. It's just so varied. I mean, you talk to people from there. I know a couple guys from Africa who live locally. One guy used to fight in the Ethiopian army, and you talk to a guy from Ethiopia, you get one story. You talk to a guy from Morocco, you get a totally different story.
Well, but hold on. North Africa is a little bit more, but okay. I'm just saying, like, it's doesn't fit that the ethnic composition thing you mentioned with the sub-Saharans, because that one is much more the crossing of tribes. That fits more in the. But anyway, sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, it's pretty well. I have to go. I have a dog who was looking like he wants another walk. So I'll talk to you guys probably next week.
All right, take care, Wayne.
Have a good one.
Bye-bye.
But I guess my point in what I was saying to Wayne was, at least now, as opposed to even when Gaddafi was around, and that wasn't that long ago, what, 15 years ago? At least now there are different options now that didn't exist when a guy like Sankara was around. So, your Traores of the world and the movements that are happening in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, Chad will probably be the next one. At least they have other options to go to, be it, China, Russia, or even India at this point. And that's just showing the growing shift to the multicultural world that we're all going through. And my assumption is that, as the decades go on, hopefully, you're going to see a lot more partnerships with the African nations, with the multicultural community, because keep in mind, as you know, Africa is just untapped for so many different reasons. They're untapped in terms of resources, and more importantly, they're untapped in terms of human capital, because unlike the rest of our countries, where we're all getting old and gray, Africa is the only continent that's actually got a young population. And, we're going to need those people for work and all that other stuff in the future. So I can see Africa in the 21st century, the late half of the 21st century, is going to be a pretty big deal. And you're starting to see the beginnings of that right now with this geopolitical restructuring that we are starting to see in places like the Sahel. And then everything that's going on in Sudan, which I want to talk to you about because I'd like to learn more. But I guess the key takeaways of where we're at right now is Africa, the colonialism was imposed on them. That, I think, is coming to an end. And now we're seeing a rebirth of the African continent, hopefully, through this geopolitical battle, let's say, between the various multipolar powers.
Well, glad you mentioned Sudan, and by extension, we can also touch on Ethiopia. I think that's a good segue because, for example, like what you mentioned about design, yes, it is by design, but that was not in order to split up Africans, because they were already split up. That's why many of them ended up in a civil war with each other afterwards. But then that kind of actually back then, when Sankara was alive. And yes, I fully agree with you. Not only do they now have more options in because before it was also like the United States or the Soviet Union, which put you in a pretty tough spot either way, right? You're going to get beaten one way or the other. And yes, you're still going to get beaten in one way or the other. You are going to be the subordinate, but you have more wriggle room. And one of the reasons you have more wriggle room would be, like in the case of Thomas Sankara, it's maybe not comparable to now, because it's not so much the ethnic and tribal cohesion and so forth in Burkina Faso as would be problematic in many other African countries. But now many of the African countries do have, they've lived in these new social constructs for couple of generations now. Like even South Africa, which was explicitly an imperial dominion, its whole setup is imperial still in structure, right? That's why it has in its constitution the right for self-determination, because it recognizes itself, right, not to be that. But many other countries in Africa do have built more of a national identity. It may not necessarily be predominant, but let's say, for example, Ghana and Nigeria, they're considered very similar. Like they have many cultural similarities. They're considered similar people and whatever. But even as a foreigner, you will notice like they are distinctly different in their way of seeing things and mannerism and stuff like that. Therein, for example, Ghanaians, while they do have like tribal affiliations and loyalty, they tend to first and foremost see themselves as Ghanaian. They have never had any civil war, tribal wars like that. Nigeria, on the other hand, there you would find less of a national, like it's still there, of course, but it will tend to be more the tribal loyalty. So are you Igbo, Hausa, or Yoruba, for example? And this can easily be explained by them having had actually a civil war, a very, very brutal one. So like,
Sure.
and you're seeing now, like, they're still like having, be it ethnic or be it like religious or something in the north, like close to like 10,000 people a year being killed and massacred, entire villages being driven apart, So it's and that's internally. They have more conflict internally in Nigeria than any other actual conflict. Well, barring Ethiopia and Sudan, which is yeah. I've been a little bit out of the loop of the updates. I have the far as I know the yeah. Let me hear it from you what you have seen so far, or like
Well, I
your
guess
view.
my question is, are there tribal, fuckery going on? And has there been tribal fuckery going on there for thousands of years? Probably. Yeah, I'd buy that. But who's really stoking the flames on, for example, all the shit that's going on in Mali or Nigeria with these Al Qaeda groups? I would argue, you know who, right? It's the West. These are the people that fund these groups and direct them on what to do and where to go. So the reason, for example, the French were kicked out of Mali, they weren't doing anything there. And quite the opposite, they were found, there was a lot of evidence to suggest that they were actually colluding with the Al Qaeda people that they were supposed to be kicking out, because the end goal was to keep Mali down. And that seems to be a template that's been, rolled out all throughout Africa. And I think that the people in those countries see that now. And they're kind of like, okay, our alliance with France did not work, or our alliance with Portugal, or insert whatever country you want. These things just aren't working for us now. And that's why you start to see them shift towards in China for investment models and Russia, as an example, for security models. Because at least they can say, well, the Russians are going to come in. They're going to, clear out whatever riffraff are kicking around. And if they say that they're going to do it, they'll probably do it, because the Russians have a track record of doing so. Look at Syria as an example. So I think that the reason why they're shifting towards these other partners, frankly, the colonials just haven't been of any benefit to them whatsoever. Like, what benefit has France been, in the continent of Africa, particularly since they've been quote liberated from France? Nothing. It's the same old shit. So yeah, I think that that's what we're seeing now in various parts of Africa too. Is now you've got a situation whereby the Chinese have come in, and either good, bad, or indifferent, the people in Africa seem to have a lot more tolerance towards Chinese investment than they ever had Western investment, because they've got the track record of Western investment not being in their best interest. And same thing with Russian involvement in security and stuff like that. So here's Vaughn. Good day, sir.
Vaughn.
How are you?
Hey.
So I kind of
I was gonna say. I mean, I think a lot with Africa. I think a lot of people give Russia a lot more credit than they.
Oh yeah.
Not that they don't deserve credit, but the idea that Russia's there as some kind of benevolent force for good. I mean, they are to a certain degree, but it's all about the money. I mean, when Wagner
Of
was
course.
there, that's what they were about. The fact that you got security from them was part of the agreement, but it was more like a symptom of them being there because, for them to be able to profit the way they wanted to and achieve the geopolitical goals or strategic wedges they wanted to get, like in Mali or Burkina Faso or Niger, they had to play this game. And they're really good at the game because they've come in there and they're not seen as a colonizer. But they do have a very, and I think that's another thing like the Europeans and the Americans don't really understand is they've really built a very intense network that's designed to pacify their allies in Africa while extracting the max amount of money. I mean, just a few weeks ago, you had the United States announce that it's going to start fighting the Salafils and the fucking JNIM and shit, which now means you're basically going to be fighting alongside the Africa Corps, the Malian army, the Burkina Fasos. So now we're all on the same side again. So we're friends here, but they're bad over there in Ukraine or over there by Taiwan because there's probably Chinese. But that's one thing the Russians were really good at. They were really good at building networks of people. And it's utterly amazing what this fucking backwards, so-called, inferior military PMC organization was able to do. You're talking about people that were not only studying the history of the region, the leaders, in order to understand these people and their needs and how to best build this relationship of cooperation. They were literally paying all the different factions a percentage in taxes because they were saying, hey, dude, instead of shooting at this motherfucker or that motherfucker, why don't we all just sit here and make money? And it's worked out. And when Prigozhin and those guys got smoked, basically the only thing that happened was you eliminated a managerial level that was skimming profits. Now it's more direct with Surovikin and other people like that. But that's all. I mean, there's a book. It's called. I'll have to post it, but it really goes into the whole Africa thing. It's really amazing what the Russians do there. I mean, people can say it's all lovey-dovey and stuff, and it is. I mean, they do take care of business. They do protect people, but the way they go about, building these relationships and stuff is really a masterclass for like some of these other countries that, want to go in and just prop. It's like, why prop up one warlord when you can prop them all up and make them all happy and still go in and extract what you need and provide Russia with political or geopolitical leverage in areas that they want. And basically your mission statement is, as long as what you're doing is beneficial to the state, we pretty much have a hands-off, approach to it with obviously within reason. They're not going to let people go do like genocides and shit and go full, apocalypse now, Colonel, whatever.
But I mean, it didn't seem to have much problem with that in Sudan, but okay.
But I'm just saying, I mean, well, that's what people say. But, when you're fighting that kind of a war, it's a two-way street. I mean, they're complaining about people getting killed and chopped up, and I'm sure that they gingerly handed all the Wagners that they kill and give them a full burial and, salute them in the flag too. So it's like, and it's Africa. You know what? Everyone's shocked that Africa's wars are savage and brutal. I mean, what? Because the guy's wearing a skirt and gets chopped up, that's better or worse than a guy wearing EMR and a flak jacket getting blown into 4 pieces by a fucking drone?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good thing because, I mean, RSF, the thing is that they are gleefully intimate in their work. And like they get up close, run people down and stuff. But and they film it, they can't help it, that part. But the SAF is hardly any.
Time out for a sec, because this is a good segue, because I want you to tell me all about Sudan. So I'm glad you're here. I know you know a lot about it. But basically what we're at now at our point in history is you've got Africa as this geopolitical chessboard. which has been dominated by the West. Now you've got other multipolar players on the scene, whether it be, Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, India. All of these players are starting to come in now. So I think, as I said, the last half of the 21st century, I think, is going to be really about, solidifying these relationships, which do take a lot of time, as well as building up the continent. However, we also have conflicts. So whether they be in the Sahel, whether it be in Sudan, whether it be in Ethiopia, we still have these conflicts that have broken out. But when you look under the hood, they look like, to me anyway, more geopolitical proxy wars between the greater powers. Tell me I'm wrong, because Sudan is a perfect example. The narrative we get here in the West is one day these two generals decided to battle over who should have the control over Sudan, and there's been a war raging ever since. And you've got the what do they call, the SDF or SAF? What are they called? The Sudanese forces versus the RSF.
Sudanese Armed
They're
Forces is SAF, and then you have Rapid
SAF,
Support
right.
Forces, which is RSF. Yes.
Right. So now you've got these two forces that are fighting. I think most people outside the West, myself included, don't know the nitty gritty details of what led to this. So I'll stop right now. Take it away, sir. Give us the history. What are they fighting over? Why? Who's backing them? Whether it be the UAE, Qatar, US, France, you name it. Give us the rundown, because I'd love to hear about Sudan 101.
Yeah. Okay. What are they fighting over? Is generally power and control. That's a simple answer to that. The external backers, that's one of the fascinatingly complex ones. This is where you will find actors that are generally contentious with each other elsewhere, fighting on the same side in this conflict, which is a weird one, but not entirely. So first of all, I guess, how did the civil war kind of break out? The Sudan had been under a dictatorship under a guy called Omar Bashir for about 30 something years, which is, as you were just to kind of wrap up the colonial part, it kind of pertains. You see all them dictators, remember 15 years ago, that fell, that had been around for 30, 40 years. It tends to be a trend. After 30, 40 years, it doesn't matter how popular you were, it doesn't matter how good or bad you were, you're going to get finished. And this is the case for the colonial part as well. The Africans are now having another generation or two to get a test with someone else. But then we get with Omar al-Bashir, where the generational trigger, kind of, I think that's kind of a way to put it. Like every generation, there's going to be something that causes a seismic change, and then it matters like how does this and that country deal with it. Well, in the case of Sudan, having been under military dictatorship, it did go the way as many others. So they had a lot of internal tension that had them go over for, I'm really simplifying here, but they went over for semi-democratic processes. And for a while, it seemed to be going kind of well, but they were also playing it. Well, but the bottom line is it was very short-lived, and the strongmen resumed. And the way they did it was that the one who is the SAF now, which is Burham, he allied with Hemedi, which is the one who led the RSF. And what caused the rip was that to coup the democratic government, right? So they took over that part. And then once they had done so, Burham of the SAF wanted RSF included into the incorporated into the army, which Hemedi probably correctly saw as, he's going to be losing that power, because so far he has direct control. Now he becomes a subordinate into this and that system. So prior to that, so the RSF is actually a leftover from the Janjaweed. So the previous dictator that they both couped, both the SAF and the RSF, was actually instrumental in creating modern day RSF via the Janjaweed. So they would take these ethnically, they're considered Arabs. Like for you and me, they would kind of just look like sub-Saharan African, but it's more of a culture thing. So because Sudan has been heavily influenced by Islamic conquest and stuff like that. I mean, that's why it's 99 something % Muslim. So, but
Sure.
so on there's some ethnic elements that are also cultural, and that turned into the Darfur genocide, but like shorthand, to which Omar al-Bashir was facilitating that and using the then Janjaweed, which became, I think it translated Devil's Horseman, which became core elements of the RSF. And they are the ones that are considered to be like doing the excesses of war crimes and so forth under their control. But that being said, though, like the SAF are also known for indiscriminately shelling into civilian areas and stuff like that. So, there are no good sides in this conflict. But that's
Sure.
basically it. The attempt was to, there are some more details, I'm sure, and I'm also a little bit fussy on the memory, but they basically, Burham wanted to incorporate the RSF into the official army, which Hemedti would not accept, and though the war broke out. And that was in April 2023. And since then, the RSF made some surprising advances because they didn't have combined arms, they didn't have jet fighters or anything. And it's something that the SAF had help with from Egypt. But still, they had a lot of the SAF had limited manpower, and they had some other issues. But the RSF had a lot more momentum on the ground. Like what they lacked in combined arms, the SAF did not have enough to actually effectively counter it. Even though they would be reigning supreme where they did, it will only be like on some locations, whereas the RSF could advance more broadly. Recently, that is, after a few years now, that has been turned back, and some of the things that have occurred. So I guess here we should go around the external backers, to which the RSF has first. It had the UAE, the Emiratis. They have been the principal backers of the RSF from the get-go. So the UAE is one of the biggest gold exporters in the world, and they don't have gold. They get it from Sudan. So that's the quid pro quo with the RSF in a sense. So they've been known for shipping in supplies, both Chinese armaments, but they've also, of course, there's some American armaments that trickled over and stuff like that. And the Russians have, of course, also been there. So there's a Russian, they have some of the more, what really helped them turn the tide was actually the Russian armaments. So the Chinese have primarily, the Chinese armaments that the UAE has shipped over, which is not to say that the Chinese deliberately sent it. This can just be a roundabout way that the UAE can find to get their interest in West Sudan without having the Americans triggered anything anymore or something like that.
Sure.
But what the Russians did, because they have direct interest and direct exchanges with gold mines as well. So what they did was provide some anti-aircraft armaments, which negated one of the quintessential edges that the SAF had. And that's when which was the air superiority, of course. So that's when the RSF really gained momentum.
So
Yeah,
can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So basically now you've got two sides. You've got the SAF, which you said was supported by Egypt largely, but it's also supported by Saudi Arabia, by Turkey, by Qatar, by Iran.
Yeah.
Which is ironic because isn't the SAF being supported by the US as well? So on one side, the Iranians and the US are on the same side, are they not? And then on the RSF side, to your point, they're backed by the UAE, they're backed by Russia, who have the gold interests, as you mentioned, but they're also backed by other regional players like Ethiopia, Kenya, Chad, Libya. They all support the RSF as well. And I'm just wondering why that's so. Why do we have, forgetting the money interests? I know why Russia's there. I know why America's there. I know why UAE is there. But why are, for example, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey on one side versus Chad, Libya, and Ethiopia on the other. Like, what? I don't understand the disconnect there between these regional countries and why they would be on different sides.
Yeah, it really, like, I think that it's precisely because one cannot find a clean cut one side and the other side is one of the reasons that this falls into a black hole. The Let me see. Let me start here. So let's take the Arabs and the Egyptians, like the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Emirati, and the Iranians on one side with Turkey. I think the United States. I'm not so sure if they. Yeah, there were some weapons I think in the recent offensive, like the because the SAF have had some gains now, and that probably correlates a bit. But as far as I understood, the Americans were primarily political recognition and backing and some stuff like that. But the SAF is also supported by the Russians. That they were actually having long-term negotiations for getting a Russian naval base in Port Sudan. Like everyone wants to have a naval base in Port Sudan. Like Djibouti, Djibouti, everyone has a right, wants the right, right? I'm not talking about the booty of your wife, right? But Port Sudan is kind of like that. So the Russians in the beginning, I think they were kind of like snubbing like they were kind of trying to pressure the SAF for concessions for a naval base in Port Sudan. So that's why they took such a relatively one-sided support of the RSF, because they had more interest there and they wanted to use that to coerce the SAF to give them what they have wanted for a long time, namely a port in Sudan. So now they're actually also, they have changed over, so they're kind of playing, they have a tentative arrangement with either side, basically. The Saudis, so the Egyptian, and it must be explained via Ethiopia. So that's the Nile Dam project. So Ethiopia has been building a dam, and that's caused quite a lot of stir. And this is also why Ethiopia so that's the regional actually makes sense, right? The Egyptians will support the SAF, who in turn are also supportive of the TPLF, which are against the Ethiopian government. And Ethiopia is aligning in way with the UAE to get the in addition to whatever trade agreements they have, but aligning in the direction of RSF providing a training basis, and this is in part to actually counter Egypt as well. So yeah, that's where I think kind of like part of the complications start getting in. So like the Russians, I would say they're playing either side quite clearly. The Turks seem to be wanting this for a naval base, the same as the Russians. They want influence in the Red Sea, and this is kind of one can see as substantiated by them having naval base in Mogadishu in Somalia, and trying to establish themselves there. So that interest is fairly clear cut. And so now of course this is a favor then for getting a position in Port Sudan as well. The Saudis, that is has actually well, how was that one? Because I think the Saudis had for a long time not recognized, like they had condemned, like they didn't like pull them back, like they had cut connections or something like that with the government of Sudan, and I don't remember exactly why that was, but they ended up changing it to provide diplomatic recognition, and one of the reasons had to do with the war in Yemen. So, because in the war in Yemen, the RSF, the Janjaweeds, so much of their combat experience was acquired, and this is where also they kind of partly get connected with the UAE. No, afterwards they get connected with the UAE. They were actually fighting the UAE back then because they were fighting for the Houthis, which were actually against the UAE. So it's kind of like, yeah, this has been really messy already, but the RSF fought they fought with the Houthis. Sorry, yeah, they fought with the Houthis, and which were then against the UAE and Saudi Arabia in particular, and that caused Saudi Arabia to lift some of their diplomatic restrictions, if I remember correctly, and thus side with the SAF, yeah. Iran is a very limited capacity, so it's I'm not entirely. I think that's more like a soft power play that they're just, because it's more like some Shahid drones and stuff like that. But as far as I've understood it, their involvement there is, of course, it is pertaining to the foothold they already have in the area with the Houthis and so forth. So it's definitely connected in that regard. But the ironic twist is then, why would they support then the SAF when it was the RSF that actually helped their allies in Yemen, right? So that
Right.
part is a bit unclear for me.
That's why this whole thing just confuses the hell out of me. And like, let's use the dam as an example, right? So we got Egypt up here, right? River Nile, all that stuff. We've got Ethiopia here, right? To those who don't know, and feel free to add more color to it.
Are you pulling your cursor? Are you pulling your cursor over the map?
Yeah, I was right here.
Oh, okay. Because
Yeah,
I don't see the cursor.
Oh, sorry. I thought you could see it, but you got Egypt up here
Oh,
in
no, I see it.
the
That's mine,
northeast, and then Ethiopia is right here. So for those who are unaware, and feel free to add more color to it, but basically, in a nutshell, Ethiopia is building a dam. It's a hydroelectric power thing, I think, and there are other nations in the region, primarily Egypt, who are complaining about it because they believe that it could cause environmental issues and problems with the Nile drying up, et cetera, et cetera. So basically, there's been a big dispute over this dam since they announced the construction of it. I'm simplifying it. Feel free to add more to it, but that's the dam issue that we're talking
just to
about.
underscore how serious what you're saying was, Egypt said that they keep a military option open to dismantle the dam if they consider it to be too threatening. So they do consider it that serious. So yeah.
Okay. So here's my question then. You've got Sudan, you've got Egypt opposing them, but then all the other countries around Sudan, whether it be Ethiopia, Kenya, Chad, and Libya primarily, they all support the RSF. Why would that be, having one side support the SAF and the other side supporting the RSF, if the underlying issue is this dam? Because wouldn't the dam affect everybody? You know what I mean? And that's what I don't understand about this conflict. To your point, there are so many contradictions around these countries, so siding with one side here and another side here. It's really confusing. I just don't understand why the other countries would support the RSF if that's like a primary driver.
Well, I think, okay, but yeah, because it gets actually extra confusing when you consider that the RSF is considered more like an Arabist faction and somewhat anti-Islamist, anti-Islamic. Not anti-Islamic, but they're anti-Islamist. So they're generally at odds with jihadis.
Okay.
Which means the Muslim Brotherhood. And Egypt is also vehemently against the Muslim Brotherhood. And the
Sure.
SAF have been employing jihadis. That's where they've had often a lot of success, was precisely utilizing jihadis, which are, pretty much indisputably Muslim Brotherhood connected. So, and the Muslim Brotherhood is considered one of the greatest enemies to the Egyptian military state. So it's additionally confusing, that part as well. But I think the reason that one is because Egypt lacks means to, like, Ethiopia has a comparative advantage by being in possession of the dam and far away. So what Egypt has to do in order to stop that, it's a much steeper uphill battle. So I think they're just willing to compromise with, like, as long as they can keep it in Sudan and not in Egypt. That's why they, for example, want to keep Hamas out of Egypt, because that's Muslim Brotherhood too. So they don't want, because they know that the way they operate, and the abilities that can come with it, is a threat to them politically. So as long as they can keep it outside of Egypt, they seem to be okay, somewhat cooperating with it. That's how I kind of interpret the military state of Egypt. And in this case of Sudan, this will be more like the SAF. I think they just simply recognized that the SAF had been so hard pressed up against the wall that they recognized, like, okay, if we cannot provide military support to the SAF where they don't need the jihadis, we just have to accept that they will use jihadis. And I think that's kind of, or the Muslim Brotherhood to be more specific. And they want, and so for the Egyptians, this goes to Eritrea. No, not partly Eritrea, but actually more northern Ethiopia with the TPLF, who are siding with the SAF. They are more friendly with the SAF. And the TPLF. So this goes to a war that I think ended. Was it like a year or so into the Ukraine war in 2022, I believe? Oh, they're bounced back, yeah. And it's been like a very tentative ceasefire / peace agreement been made, but things are stirring up, and it might be that the situation in Ethiopia is stirring up precisely because Egypt is trying to encourage the TPLF.
Hey, that book is an audio book too. So
what?
That audio book I sent Nunya.
Oh, you sent in
that book about the whole Wagner and Africa and all that.
Yeah, let me just post it in the main chat here. I'll check.
I was going to say something real quick while you're talking about all the Muslim stuff too. That Captain Ibrahim guy made some kind of proclamation like 2 weeks ago that Burkina Faso is a Muslim country, but they do not want Sharia law, and he was directing it, I guess, at people that had left the country to go study, Islamic law or Sharia law or whatever in Saudi Arabia. And he said, if you're doing that, don't come back. You're not wanted here. You're not welcome here. Come back with technology, science, things that can improve the life of, the everyday Burkina Faso citizen. So I thought that was kind of interesting too. I mean, he really put his foot down. Like it was worded as like, you don't want to go back because you're not going to be protected, and they don't want you there preaching Sharia law. So that's kind of an interesting thing that happened in the last couple of weeks too with all this.
Yeah, it's that's probably a part and parcel of the Marxist, because the Burkina Faso was very close to the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and got a lot of institutions built up during that, and a lot of just schooling and education. But this is the Thomas Sankara fellow. Again, he's a very special dude. He really put a nationalistic twist to that. So and now that they're combating jihadis, they had what was it? This was while I think that had recently gotten the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. So that would be November 2024. But it was a bit before. It was during the summer, yeah. So during the summer of 2024, there was one single day attack that took over 500 people in Burkina Faso, and they had been digging trenches and trying to consolidate themselves. Now, I suspect the main reason we heard about that was in order to kind of put a bad light on Russia and their failure to provide adequate security, which arguably seems to be the case. They're clearly pressured enough elsewhere to have a good reason to not prioritize the Sahel, and so the jihadis are getting.
I think they kind of took advantage of a situation.
Yeah, for sure,
and they obviously had outside help. I mean, since that whole incident where they, made a big splash, fucking up, Wagner and the Malian army and that convoy. I mean, they haven't really done much since then. I mean, they've been blunted, they've been stopped, they've been getting killed. I mean, once things kind of sorted out, the quick flash in the pan, hope for the jihadists is gone. I mean, I'm not saying they won't have good days and stuff, but I kind of felt like a lot of people really jumped on that quick too. Like, oh, look how Russia's getting kicked out of. It's like that's not really what's happening. You had a moment in time there where something happened, and now that adjustments have been made, that's not happening anymore. And if anything, it's the people that conducted that attack or the jihadists are probably getting more and more pounded with the fact the United States has now offered to come in and attack
I
the JNIM.
wanted to ask you that because it just feeds into the same confusion that we get into East Africa, right? How do we have all these external powers that are at odds with each other and now seemingly supporting sides that are fighting against it, like themselves, basically? The United States in Mali now fighting with alongside basically the Africa Corps. To what extent are we talking? And like,
I mean, maybe they won't be fighting literally side by side, but it's like, if okay, you guys are in Mali and Niger, and we'll be over here in Chad and maybe Southern Libya. It's like they're still fighting the same basic groups. I mean, by name. So, I mean, I don't see them side by side, but it's like now you're going to basically put the jihadis in a multi-front war where you can be attacked from whatever countries the United States is allowed to operate from, that direction, plus whatever the Russians or the EU's allowed to operate from, whatever direction that would be.
Okay, call me coping, but that sounds so fucking wholesome. Imagine like all this thing about getting a new security architecture in Ukraine and whatever. That's one of the main reasons that all this war is going on there. And then, the Russians and Americans, they slowly get to the African continent. They chill and lay back a little bit with them, the OG Negroes, and kind of figure out that, hey, you know what, actually, we might actually take this security arrangement cooperation over to the Europeans back in. That's okay. I know that sounds a little bit fantastical, but I couldn't help it. but it does, right? That if the Americans and Russians are cooperating in that degree, right? It kind of is suggested like if that sets a precedence for something that might be ripple over positively in Ukraine. I'm not sure. Maybe I'm too optimistic on that.
I mean, I don't really know. I mean, that could be true, but I mean, like I kind of feel like they might just maybe we'll bomb them, and because we have more drones and aircraft, so we can bomb random JNI guys, whereas maybe the Russians and the Malians will be more involved on the ground because they're there on the ground trying to and I'm sure some of it's too is like everybody's trying to put on their best show as they court all these African governments with all the wealth and stuff they have, and they all want to get a piece of the action. So I'm sure that's a lot of it too. I mean, the Africans are smart. They'll let these guys come in and clean out a lot of their problems. It's just you got to figure out how to regulate that relationship to where they're doing you a solid, and yeah, you can pay them for it and do them a solid, but you're not really like trying to become a vassal or overly dependent on them. It's like, hey, I got something you want, you got something I want. Why don't we just be cool with each other? And that would be the ideal thing. But obviously, the United States or other countries would want, they want to be cool with you, but they want you to sell uranium to them for like $2 a pound.
It's interesting to note how like we're touching on the China again on this. Like they don't do military presence like the Russians and Americans do. It's kind of interesting to see how like the approach that they're doing, because Russia has had some with Mali and Burkina Faso with
there was an incident
among other things
where Russia and China doesn't, because China was having problems, I think, at one of their gold mines, and then Russia showed up and basically kicked them out and took it over because they had a better, the government that I don't remember which particular government, but they were in touch with the people that said that they were in charge now. And once they got this all sorted out, they cut the Chinese back in too. So it was some kind of joint, like at the time it was convenient for Russia to kick everybody out and take over. But then once, the peace was made and the business had to be done, then, the Chinese were brought back in for their, whatever part of the operation. I mean, that's what's kind of crazy. I mean, not to romanticize it, but the whole thing in Africa between like China, the United States, Russia, not really so much India yet, and maybe not even the EU, because they kind of got punked out, I think, over all the colonial stuff. But just those three cowboys in there right now, there's a lot of crazy ass shit going on, and a lot of wheeling and dealing going on, a lot of gentlemanly conduct in some ways, and downright horrific conduct in other ways. It's just a really weird place. It's got to be interesting times to be involved in that whole thing. Because like I was saying, if you look at what Wagner was doing, I mean, they're literally hiring people to do polls and survey people and learn the history of the region just so that they could better make inroads into people's hearts and minds to make the better deals and convince them that, I mean, just the investment that they were doing. And this is Wagner. This is even like the Russian, diplomatic corps. This is just, and now granted, they do have directives to go out and do stuff, but this is stuff they're doing polls. They're funding campaigns for this opponent against that guy. But the guy they're funding the campaign against, they're also giving him money to say, hey, just chill, dude. When this is over and done with, we'll all be friends. We'll all get a cut of, it's just crazy what's going on. So I think there's a lot of, I think a lot of people are actually kind of happy with the way it is to some degree or another, because they're all getting to play and wheel and deal and do man shit, be warlords. I mean, I think there's a lot of people that are actually kind of happy with the whole stretch of the West Africa coast, maybe, parts of North Africa and then Central Africa.
But can I ask you a question? Do you know if that's the same with because Wagner was basically removed and replaced with basically the Russian army, right?
No. Really, what happened is basically, like, if you take out like the administrative level of Wagner, because that's basically what they did when Prigozhin died and Ukhin died. You had Surovikin, who was a direct competitor of Prigozhin and Wagner, because he had his own PMCs in Africa doing the same thing. And also the other thing is crazy people don't realize is you have like the PMCs.
Surovikin was the guy who was in Syria for most of the time, right?
Yeah, but he also ran Redoubt, which is a PMC. Then you had and see the problem is like not so much a problem, but the way they're operating. You have Wagner, then you have let's say Surovikin's PMCs, then you've got the Ministry of Defense, then you've got the Diplomatic Corps, then you've got the FSB. All these motherfuckers are running game down in these countries and presenting deals and options and providing services to get more options and to get buy-ins to control more assets or people or territory. And like I said, it was very impressive. And once those guys were gone, basically Surovikin and those guys basically absorbed that entire infrastructure. Maybe it's a little bit more focused now than before, but you're talking about people that basically had unlimited authority to do whatever they thought was best for Russia and get rich doing it. And like I said, they're running campaign ads against one guy, supporting another guy secretly, propping up people, paying off everybody. Like I said, doing, genealogical research. I mean, it was just insane the kind of shit they were pulling. I mean, just to get these people's trust, and not to say it was disingenuous, but, they really put the effort in to get the payout, which you got to give them credit for that. A lot of countries aren't really putting that kind of effort in and haven't put that effort in. They just want to come in, dig a hole, take the gold and run. They don't want to, work something out, even though it's still exploitive and all that, but it's far less exploitive than the British model or the Dutch model, or and some people might argue and say it's more exploitive, but all I'm saying is that they do put a lot of effort into building this relationship in this environment that everybody can prosper from. And obviously, since it's their idea, they want to prosper the most, but that's fair.
If I just put before it's a smart move, and I strongly suspect one of the reasons they're doing so, because at first, when the reason I asked if there's a distinction between Wagner and the official is because it's a private military operation, so it has its own incentive structure that may explain why they're a little bit more on the ground doing the polling, trying to figure out how to kind of navigate their own little organization around the country. But when you have that also, it was comprehensive in a way that it also facilitates for state capture, or not capture, let me be generous, influence, right? So it's a smart move for them to do. And I suspect that one of their incentives to actually do so is because they need to find another avenue to influence, really influence the state apparatus, because they cannot operate with the international institutions and the other leverages that would typically apply, which is a kind of like an interesting, like a, you know, that it goes back to a thing we say back here in Norway: nothing is so bad that it cannot be good for something. So yeah, but yeah, Nuno, I think you were trying to say something.
Oh no, I was just going to say that I think the Chinese figured out a long time ago something that we never did. You know, in the West, it was always about, you know, controlling them via military, controlling them by political influence. So we're going to give you this deal if you put the puppet that we want in. You're going to give us this deal, or we're going to bomb the hell out of you, whatever it may be. Whereas the Chinese figured out a long time ago, you don't need to control the area. You don't need to control the government. All you need to do is control the supply chains. And that's effectively what they've been building out. And, you know, it's Silk Road 2.0, but if you control the logistics, you don't really need to control anything else. And that's what we're seeing now in places like Africa, in places like South America, where they're building out these ports, building out roads, railroads, all this stuff. It's not because the Chinese want to help anybody out. They just want to control the logistics, the supply chains. And it seems to be working out well. And Devon's point, at the very least, at least the Africans are getting economic benefit from that. At least they're getting increased, you know, ability to move around or whatever it may be. They're getting something out of it versus the old IMF model, which is, you know, they were getting next to nothing, and whatever they were getting just was crap, you know. So
well, you're seeing Africa have progressed very much since like it progressed like I mean, colonization bad and all that stuff, but the Africans, they progressed by leaps and bounds and centuries with the colonization. And they also were, while it was, you know, not before them that the Europeans made and carved up those lines and whatever, when they set up those institutions, what they did provide to many of the Africans was a larger societal order they could operate with, unlike before, because before they were just killing each other, as we would do in
Well,
Norway,
I mean,
for example.
like in the current situation too. I mean, you know, when you have these uncles, these big brothers, you know, some people would say uncle's a racist term, but you know, that's what you know. They're, you know, the white uncles are referred to, the ones that come in and, you know, help their brother Africans. I mean, the smart countries in Africa are going to be the ones that, you know, ally or work with, you know, uncle, and form these coalitions
Rwanda.
of intelligent people that realize, hey, I have X, Y, and Z, and they need it. You know, I can get them to build schools and hospitals and roads. I mean, no one's asking you to turn it into some Mesopotamia or utopia for Africans. But I mean, I think you're going to see some of the smarter countries in like Northwestern Africa and North Africa. They're going to realize that there's a finite amount of time where you're going to have big brother interest in this area, people willing to put up with shit. So it's like, you know, shit or get off the pot. You know, maybe it won't be peaceful. Maybe it'll be like, you know, Central African Republic and it's made up of 5 countries, or maybe it'll be some West African Ivory Coast Confederation. But I think the countries that are like playing ball right now and doing business probably have the best chance of pulling themselves out into something sustainable. I don't know about the middle of Africa really, and then South Africa. I mean, they're savable, but that's kind of on them to decide that. But I mean, you know, between Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, the Ivory Coast and shit, that seems like that would be the best place to try and get some kind of long-term stability that would, you know, maybe have more direct control over the entire continent.
I think
that's kind of what's needed.
I think what you're saying, and also Nuno is generally saying, and I agree with you guys, it is that like the you don't know how much of a benefit it is, but the net effect, I will say, still is benefit, because well, what is the story for these African countries? Like they have been, the continent has been historically one of the most fragmented ones in like any human history. So that's why it was that's why, for example, colonization, it provided actually a gift. It is the gift of empire, as I call it. We have Norway as a united polity. That is part because of the Byzantine Empire. right? So like, but we were fortunate; we did not have the direct conditioning like the others, like the from the Britons to the Israelites had with the Romans. They had direct conditioning, right? And that's what the Africans had. They had direct conditioning, so it's a lot more visceral. But the empires are now long gone, and but the institutions remain. And the question becomes for the Africans: okay, now you have this larger societal order you would only have managed to acquire if you were able to comprehensively defeat your enemies. Those are now your fellow citizens. What you do with it is your choice, and you can see very clear difference from. So, like Burkina Faso is one good example, and on what Vaughn was saying here, play with Uncle Rwanda, right? Rwanda is one who sides with the West in the way like they're not a clientele of the West like most others. Like they're not signing deals with IMF and all those kind of things just to enrich themselves, like the kleptocrats to enrich themselves. In Rwanda, they're built and actually like clean streets. It's fairly like yeah, it's honestly looks better than several places in Europe, to be honest. So it's yeah, I think that's like a pretty good like if you are of the African countries, like maybe crumbs is not the right thing because it's often associated with famine, which I think is a misnomer. Like Africans, generally speaking, aren't starving. That's just in the conflict zones when they are maybe many, but Africa is also big, so I don't think that's often a little bit overblown. But anyways, yeah, it's no doubt about it. Like you can see several examples throughout, but I don't want to be rambling too much. Um, we got a little bit. Are we focusing on West Africa, the overall of the external influence, or are we going to focus on East Africa?
You can talk about whatever you want. Yeah. Yeah, East
Yeah.
Africa works. We can talk about Ethiopia or wherever.
Well, because I was I was getting to some part of it close when I was talking on East Africa, which is where Ethiopia was interesting, right? They have their internal issues with the Tigray in the Tigray region, which is in the north of Ethiopia. Once seen on the map, the part that borders the northwestern part that borders both Eritrea and Sudan, that's a Tigray area, and that had the like estimate of like 500,000 or something like that people that was killed. So it was no small matter at all, and that's over the course of just a couple of years, right? So it's very much up there with Sudan, which had more, but they're also larger. But anyways, so the recent, as far as I've got it, there's been escalations going on, which is if it's true that Egypt is behind it, because they're allied with the TPLF, who are kind of like they used to be. Okay, so short history on Ethiopia. The TPLF they came to power. I think it was in the 70s or 80s or something like that. And they basically they are a minority group that basically acquired control. And after a few decades, that was kind of contested too much, and they were it ended up with a war. I'm oversimplifying, but therein Eritrea, which is that green country you see on the map, it was actually against the TPLF, which are Tigrayan people, and that is exactly why it is surprising, because the majority ethnic population in Eritrea are Tigray. But during the civil war, because Eritrea came to be with a civil, they were kind of a union, but basically subordinate of Ethiopia. And in the 70s, they had a civil war, a couple of rounds of civil wars, and eventually Eritrea again managed to prevail and gain independence, making Ethiopia landlocked. And here I have actually, I think this is where Djibouti comes in when it comes to Sudan and all that kind of part. But that's one thing. But what? So you might think then, right, that the Eritrean government would be on the side of the Tigrayans, right, because they've had a civil. They didn't gain their independence by colonial provision. No, they actually had to fight their neighbor. And it's a but the TPLF are rivals of Verki, the whatever you want to call it, of Eritrea, the leader of Eritrea. So for him, it's a strategic threat and a long-term threat. It has been that for a long time, like a long-term rival. So that's why they actually joined forces with Ethiopia to take out the TPLF. So the Eritreans are thus.
How does that make?
Yeah.
How does that make him like? What is his popularity then within his own country? Because I would think that a lot of Eritreans, I know I butchered that. They're probably opposed to killing their own people.
I am not entirely sure about that. I just know that I talked to some Ethiopians that were from the region,
Mhm.
and they were from Eritrea and they were Tigray. And so when the conflict broke out, they felt it saddened. That was the general sentiment. But as for support to Afwerki, he has been an autocrat for several decades. Some people say he's a good. I would say he's, as far as autocrats go, he seemed like he's competent given the cards that are available. But I can understand also that a lot of the population are, they would not necessarily be so loyal to him that they would support operations with what they have as friends and families across the border. After all, like they're
Sure.
the same tribe of people, right? So,
Right.
and the thing that they have in Eritrea is mandatory conscription that tends to last long outside the terms that. So, like, let's say in Norway you have 1 year, but you end up in 10 years. That's often what occurs, and they are forcefully conscripted and then put into labor. So that's one of the reasons a lot of Eritreans are trying to, men in particular, are trying to escape from Eritrea. So that's so if you have a lot of Eritrean refugees and men in particular from that area, that's one of the reasons. But as to the TPLF now escalating, that actually is like they are actually, as far as things are concerned, they were defeated, not completely, but they were forced to give up some of their heavy equipment to Ethiopia when the ceasefire peace agreement, whatever, was signed in 2022. Now, most analysts have assumed that a renewed conflict between the TPLF and Ethiopia will be inevitable. But it wouldn't. They did not expect something like this to happen soon. So this is why this is a bit of a surprise, because like they should know that they are heavily outmatched. They cannot really face the Ethiopian army as it is. But they might get backing from Egypt, and if that is the case, then that is a major escalation from Egypt side towards Ethiopia, because
So,
yeah.
quick question: Who supports? So, same question that I asked you about Sudan. What external nations outside of Egypt support the TPLF versus supporting the government of Ethiopia?
Yeah, good question.
If you don't know, that's cool. But
Yeah, I
I'm
can't
just
recall, at
wondering.
least at the moment. Like, as far as I know, they are much weaker in any event, but they are, for that reason, kind of tied more to the SAF in Egypt, because that's the only place where they can find. I mean, when Eritrea, which are having predominantly the same kind of people, is also their main, like one of their biggest threats, and it's not only them, right? The other ones that they also have to face are the Amharas. So the Amharas will be neighboring the Tigrayan region, and they're one of the biggest, if not, I think it's actually the biggest ethnic group in Ethiopia. And they were deployed against the Tigrayans during the war to great effect. But the Amharans have also their own contentions with the Ethiopian government. And the Ethiopian government is currently led by one of the Oromo tribe, which is the second biggest one adjacent. So where Addis Ababa is, you see on the map, right west of that is the region that is mostly Oromo territory. And north of that, and in between a thin sliver on the northern part of Ethiopia, that's Amhara.
Mhm.
And they have changed their loyalties. Like, so they're not necessarily friendly with the TPLF. They still want to kind of, like, they're bitter rivals for a long time. So they still want to get them out. But they've also been more openly belligerent towards the Ethiopian central government. Now, here is where external players in a different manner come into play. So, in the case of Ethiopia, the vulnerability that they're now facing with that. Why this is important is because the spillover. So why do they have to actually keep the control in Sudan with the RSF? They need the RSF to be holding those positions in the border and pin up the SAF because they know the SAF is a potential liability via Egypt, and also the TPLF. But they also need to do that because they're landlocked. They have a peculiar susceptibility to the conflict in Iran. Most of their petroleum, and in particular the diesel imports, came via the Strait of Hormuz. So in May, I believe it was, they had to put a national security emergency, putting restrictions on, in particularly diesel. The Emiratis are important suppliers in this regard, but they were not the principal suppliers. The principal suppliers were the Kuwaitis. So now they managed to find, so the restriction, the emergency was lifted about a month later or so. Yeah, a bit less than a month actually, where they had managed to outsource it. So they gotten some other suppliers, and they would probably have managed to reroute the Kuwaiti supply. So I haven't managed to find out yet where they gotten the suppliers. That seemed pretty kind of misty, so to speak, foggy. But the one can pretty strongly assume that a lot of it comes from the Saudi pipeline. So that's one of their replacement. So now with the Houthis coming into play, that's of course if it's so that much of the replacement that Ethiopia got was from Saudi Arabia, then the Houthis being Houthis again that closes their supply, and threatens their supply again, and they get everything via Djibouti. And so that's why they are trying to get they try to get another coastline because they're very vulnerable being through Djibouti. And one of their arrangements with the UAE comes then via Somaliland. So Somaliland will be from the country east of Ethiopia, but if you kind of take like the corner at the right of Ethiopia and just slice
It's like this area, right?
eastwards. Yeah, I don't think people will see it on the map, but if you take that pointy part at the most eastern part of Ethiopia and just draw a line across Somalia, that's roughly how you separate Somaliland from Somalia. And Somalia
that was going to
recently...
be my next question. My next question to you was going to be, where does Somalia, because we talked about the other countries, where does Somalia come into play? Go, sir. Tell us all about this port. I read about the port a couple months ago, but I don't recall much about it other than the fact that there was a lot of people upset with Ethiopia, for wanting to build it or something like that.
So I'll get to that real soon. But basically, like the connection goes. I'm going to get to that one, but the connection, as far as I've understood it, where they cooperate with the UAE, has a lot to do with Somaliland, and that's why they're also the mutual align with the RSF. So they don't agree with the RSF because they're generally kind of brutal, but they the enemy of an enemy is a friend, right? So for now, if they get if you consider now with the Straits, like with the Houthis coming up, and you have like the situation in Iran, the situation internally then with Amharas and the TPLF again rising is a serious threat, because that prevents Ethiopia also from trying to get any access via Eritrea in a roundabout way, because conflict arises again. Not only that, if because the SAF has in Sudan had more, again, it's a place called El Obeid. It doesn't show on the map, but it's like of the northwestern like axis kind of that faces Sudan. There are two lines. That one faces southwest and one faces northwest. It's sort of midway in there is El Obeid, where the SAF has been under siege by the RSF. Now that they're pushing back, it means that the security, the peripheral security that Ethiopia has in Sudan against Egyptian influence gets reduced, right? And because they are so threatened by all the externals also being landlocked, That's part and parcel of it. So how does this align then with Somaliland? So Somaliland is actually one of the first ones to. Okay, I should explain Somaliland a bit. Somaliland is a result of a civil war in Somalia in the 80s, I believe it was, which they basically were subjected to a genocide from the south, and since then there's been a no reconciliation. Like it's been like it's ceasefire, but the Somali government considers them to be a part of it, but they are what the Somalilanders have done is that they're basically just like, nah, fuck it, we'll just set up our own economy. And here's, yes, another exception. Just like Rwanda, Burkina Faso, Somaliland, I think is like even more of a pinnacle example. For they have been operating with a more stable currency than the government. A currency that isn't even traded. And they've with more successful economy and so forth, more stable institutions, and so forth, and they're not recognized as a country. And then Israel did so was it last year? I don't remember exactly if it was last year or the year before, but they jumped in.
Last year.
Yeah. So what was interesting with that one was that Ethiopia had tried to recognize a few years before. They tried to recognize Somaliland in exchange for coast access. So instead of fighting and having a war with Eritrea or finding themselves with the because Djibouti is like that, it is really the Djibouti, that booty is really the village bicycle. Everyone has a base there, everyone has a connection right in there. That's the whole thing it is. And it's the everything that Ethiopia receives from sea, most of it goes, pretty much everything comes from Djibouti. So that means that what they will get then in Somaliland is significantly more wiggle room and much easier to negotiate more favorable deal. It's much cheaper real estate, and they can be also more comprehensively integrated because they have Ethiopia is a very multi-ethnic country. It's a result of empire, like an African empire that was not defeated and fragmented. And while there are issues therein that they will have to contest with from that, they still have cross-border relations with Somaliland, with people who are of that people, right? So it's they have many ways. They have a good leeway, just like they could potentially. Let's put it like that. Just like they could potentially have with Eritrea. Like, it's a tragedy that they ended up with having to. If they were unified, they would be doing way better. They would be a big powerhouse in that region. Unfortunately, they split. But because they also have from imperial history, cultural connections with Somaliland, they do have a good inroads. However, every single other neighboring country, everyone else, fiercely opposed Ethiopia, and there were several other countries that also fiercely opposed them, enough that the Ethiopian government eventually backed down. So they would have been the first country to recognize if it was not for that. Then a few years later, after wars and stuff, a year or two of war in the Middle East with Israel decides to jump in and recognize Somaliland. And they have had a very long-standing relationship with Somaliland since the beginning, basically. Like with Somalia too, but they found their place where they can more reasonably, have cordial relations. That was also in Somaliland. So while the government of Somalia and subsequent people had they fell in the same problem that the Saudis have, where they have kind of interests that would actually benefit them to align with Israel, for example. But they also had the ideological elements that had been so ingrained for centuries, right? That got a new renewal once the colonial era ended, right? Now they supported that because that's where you get support, like the Saudis did, and now they're against it because they're seeing that the beast they're creating is starting to devour themselves, right? But in that, using it for, I guess you can call it political expediency, true belief, whatever, it is what it is. But due to the genocide that was occurring, that the government did towards Somaliland, it made it easier for Israel to establish more long-lasting cordial relations there. And because they also had, especially because the relations are old, remember, these are many of the people who established relations there they were of fleeing the genocide of the Jews of the Holocaust, right? So they kind of had like very genuine sympathy in that direction, like that's the kind of like so with that, of course, I'm not saying there's going to not be political machinations. Of course there is, and that's where I'm going to get to it, because of course there has to be. There's no geopolitics without that. So yeah, the Houthis, again, this goes back to Yemen. So they were the ones allied with the RSF. Now it seems to be even more muddy, because when they're closing the straits, like when they started striking at Israel, the diplomat and closing the straits, hurting the countries, not only Ethiopia, but other countries in the region as well. The impetus for stopping Israel from that recognition was weaker for several reasons. One, Israel had much less to lose. They had already lost a tremendous amount of PR around the world and so forth, like political capital and whatnot, with the war going on in Gaza and shit. That, okay, you know what? You guys are, those of you who are going to complain, you're going to complain anyways. So we don't have any reason to listen. But we can get actually a significant, meaningful counter to Turkey, because Turkey is in Somalia, so they have a base in Mogadishu, right? So that's where Turkey gets in back to Sudan again. That's part of their stepping stones of getting a kind of part of the old Ottoman Empire in a sense. Not Mogadishu necessarily, but anyways, they have a base there. They are rivals of Israel, and the Houthis being striking, that puts Somaliland in strategically ideal position. And also politically, precisely because they're not susceptible to the same kind of pan-Arabic or pan-Islamist or those kind of things that tend to be the unifiers against from the Muslim world outside of any geopolitical interests, right? So that's why, for example, Israel and the Emiratis, right, because the Emiratis are heavily involved, and the Emiratis are distancing themselves also from the Islamists to the degree, and they're competing directly with Qatar, which are the principal supporters of Hamas. So that's like going around the circle with the Middle East will bring you back to Somaliland and to Sudan in that manner. So that's how they kind of that's how you get the Iron Dome crewed by Israelis on Emirati soil. It's just like, isn't it? What an exciting time we're living in.
Yeah, well, just looking at the map, you can tell that it's just looking at the map. It just tells you that it's prime real estate right there, right?
Yeah.
Right at the mouth of the Red Sea. Yeah, I can see a lot of benefits to it for a lot of different nations. So I can see why there's interest there. I guess close it off then. What's going to happen in Sudan? It's a conflict that I haven't the foggiest idea how it's going to end. No clue. Because it seems like there's just been such a back and forth ever since it started that I'm not sure who's going to win.
I am also going to be hedging my bet on uncertainty along beside you here on this one, because there's so many external actors that come into play that can put a thumb on the scale, and they will, and generally they put the thumb. I'm pretty sure they're going to put the thumb on the scale when they need to, because they have their other global interests. So RSF have been pushing. They took the capital of Khartoum, then the SAF managed to recapture. Then the RSF started making renewed rounds, and they are still supported by. We didn't mention Libya, which is another important factor here in this. But I'm not sure how long you want to go, but
up to you. Like I'm happy to keep talking. We've been going now for 2 hours and 15 minutes, so we can keep talking if you want.
I imagine like it's probably a good time for a close, so this is kind of watchable for people. But basically the RSF gets its supplies. This is important note. They don't get the majority of their supplies via Ethiopia, and that fragile supply line. That's where they get training bases and other logistical supports there, and then they get overflights from the Emiratis directly to airports that are placed in Western Sudan. But the vast majority of supply that they get that from Libya and somewhat via Chad, but it's ultimately sourced from Libya. And that is from the East Libya specifically. So Libya was split because of a civil war. And now under the rule of Caliph Haftar, I believe his name was, he is generally, I believe, having some pretty good relations with the Russians. And so if the Russians wanted to, they could pressure him. And if he wanted to, he could stop the conflict probably within like a few days or a week, because without the fuel supplies coming from there, the Toyota style warfare that the RSF is having such doing with such efficacy, it will just simply grind to a halt. It's not a matter of moral a motivation or anything like that. You can't drive because you don't got the fuel. So
Sure.
yeah. So that's like I just feel, since we have talked so much about it, where will it end? I do think precisely because there are so many actors at play that will be pushing the scale. To if things are getting too bad, then okay, I'll double down a bit, and then it's going to sway back and forth to the point where, and also with the genocidal activities that are going on, because the nation state, that concept dies for every single day when you have both sides killing civilians quite indiscriminately. Like, while the SAF are not as intimate in their the overtly genocidal in that sense, and they are targeting civilians and squeezing out in a manner that would otherwise be considered unacceptable and cause really high civilian casualties. But the especially with the West Sudan having not only the Darfur genocide, where over 300,000 people were killed, and they're primarily Masalites. So that's like a one tribe. Like, they were more specific on the ethnic groups that were going on, but the ones that were noticed this round was that they were just generally they were shot and they killed a slave Abid, and this is in Arabic, where the word slave is synonymous with Black African. And so that's kind of like a racist thing they have from that this one was just brought into like as a general thing. So now, not specific Black African tribes, but just blacks generally. And that caused, then of course, that has also caused more concern and involvement from South Sudan and several other countries there as well. So this is like, yeah, is Sudan going to remain as Sudan? Look at it; it is the biggest country on the African continent, and it has had a intermittently, seemingly hope, like it had a pretty good manufacturing industry, actually, like moderate manufacturing industry before everything broke out. They had a somewhat, like, it's not particularly remarkable, but all things considered, they had things going for them. And after this, and after all that history that they've been going through, if I had to put a bet, I would say this conflict ends with Sudan being fragmented. That's if I had to bet. Which one?
Well, this is an old map too, by the way. There's now South Sudan.
Yeah, so that's
it's
actually
already been fragmented.
Yes. So the western, I used the eastern point of Sudan of Ethiopia to kind of cut across a Somaliland. So for those looking at the map, the eastern tip of Ethiopia, no, sorry, western tip of Ethiopia, if you drive that across Sudan, that's roughly South Sudan. So it is that remaining axis and border towards Sudan. The southern part of Sudan is thus kind of in the middle, where it's important for Ethiopia that the RSF does not lose control. So yeah. By the way, Nunia, we can keep this going, or I have another suggestion. We can try to go over to our other fellow reprobate rejects at IADC and see if we can convince them to flip those time zones.
Oh,
so
buddy. They're not interested in any of this stuff. I can tell. But no, it was really good discussion, man. I appreciate your knowledge on this, because I know that you go to Africa a lot, and you know quite a bit about the continent. So I definitely learned a lot, and that's the main thing. Do you have anything to close off with?
like, share, subscribe, and don't be shy of getting on. You don't have to be on the camera to be on here. It's of course preferable. It's easier. It's more wholesome, whatever. But we understand also those of you who don't feel comfortable on the camera. But don't be shy to get on if you have something on your mind. Nothing is too stupid. We are geopolitical geeks, so sometimes when it can get a little bit, sometimes it can get a little bit like this, and sometimes we have no fucking clue. And so if you feel like you have a clue and you think that we're wrong, you should jump on. And if you think that there's something to add, you should jump on. And apart from that, yeah, share.
Well, the cool thing about this episode was in this episode open mic, all I did was I threw out a message to Coping and I said, I'd really like to talk about Africa. And we didn't plan anything whatsoever beyond that. And here we are going on 2.5 hours of talking about it. So, yeah, for sure. Like, share, and comment. And if there's anything that you'd like to ask or a topic you want to create, this is the forum for it. So we just had a 2.5 hour conversation about, the history of Africa at a very high level, as well as an overview of the current geopolitical situation in various countries. So hopefully anybody who watched it, hopefully you learned something. I certainly did. I learned a lot from this discussion today, and that's what it's all about, is just trying to broaden people's understanding of the world. Because as I said at the very beginning of this show, we just don't hear enough about Africa as much as we should. So anything that we can do to, educate people or give our opinions, that's what forums like this are for. And we've got the technology to do it. So why not, right? So yeah, I guess we'll wrap it up then, Coking, and like, share, and comment, and we'll catch you on the next episode, same bat time next week, 2 p.m. Eastern.
Thank you all for
All
watching.
right.
And thank you very much
Yeah,
for hosting,
cheers.
Yunya. Thank you very much.
Anytime, and we'll catch you next week. Cheers, everyone. Hope you learned something today. I certainly did. I have a lot of fun talking about, things that I don't know much about, because I find that I always learn something coming out of it. And I certainly did just listening to Coping and Vaughn today, for sure. Cheers, everyone. And I'll catch you on the next one. Adios.